Chapter 16. The Bones Speak. In 1956, Pope Pius XII brought in Professor Venerando Correnti of Palermo University, perhaps Europe's greatest medical anthropologist, to make a detailed clinical study of the presumed bones of St. Peter, unearthed more than 13 years before by Ferrua and Kirschbaum. Since their initial examination by the general practitioner in 1942, the bones had remained stored in the Pope's quarters, untouched and unquestioned. Kirschbaum had written that it was irresistible that these were Peter's bones. The excavators believed and reported that they had found Peter. As it turned out, the original team of excavators had been very wrong. Professor Correnti soon discovered that the bones were from several individuals, not one. In addition, they included fragments of bones from animals. Before his death in 1958, Pius XII was informed that the bones were not Peter's. Although we have no direct record of his reaction, Pius was surely bitterly disappointed. The Apostle Project, launched under his direction 20 years before, had uncovered unbelievable Roman archaeological ruins and strong evidence of Peter's presence and death in Rome, but it had not uncovered Peter's relics, the incontrovertible evidence the Pope had most hoped for. Nor did Pius apparently know the extent of Guarducci's ongoing investigation of the inscriptions. Sadly, Pius died with his dreams for the Apostle Project still not entirely fulfilled. The quest continued, however, even after the Pope's death. By 1960, Correnti had completed his examination of the bones that had so long been presumed to be Peter's. He concluded that the bones were in fact those of two men, too young to be Peter, and an old woman. Kirschbaum and Ferrua were stunned and angered by the results, which they refused to believe. Guarducci remembered the bones that had been discovered in the graffiti wall and saved by Kaas in 1942. The inscription, "Peter is within," from that wall could very well have applied to those bones, along with the many coded references to Peter she had found on the graffiti wall. Perhaps the graffiti wall inscriptions had been the ancient Christians' way of secretly marking the shrine and offering prayers there. If that were the case, the graffiti wall would in fact be an ancient tombstone. Guarducci presented the graffiti wall bones to Correnti for examination in 1962. They had remained in storage for 20 years, taken out only once in 1953 when Guarducci learned of their existence and briefly examined them. Correnti's exam. In those 20 years in storage, it appeared a mouse had crawled into the box and died. Its full skeleton remained intact. Correnti also found small fragments of animal bones and unrelated human bone fragments, which was to be expected. Long before the family tombs, Vatican Hill had been used as a body dump for thousands of years before Peter's death. But Correnti also found several remains of a single person. Extensive forensics were possible since pieces of cranium, jaw, a tooth, vertebrae, pelvis, legs, arms, and hands were all present. What Correnti found when examining the graffiti wall bones was astonishing. The bones, found very close to the inscription "Peter is here," were determined to be those of a 60 to 70-year-old robust male, approximately Peter's supposed age when he died. Even more amazing, the bones had originally been buried in the dirt next to the graffiti wall under the trophy of Gaius, rather than in the wall, as evidenced by soil still adhering to them after 1,700 years. It was also determined that they had once been covered with an early purple and gold cloth whose dye was of a type only used by imperial Romans of the 1st to 3rd centuries. Amazingly, the bones were also compatible with the remains of a person crucified upside down. The feet had been viciously cut off, as the Romans were wont to do when removing a crucified corpse because it was easier than removing nails. The bones had been moved to the graffiti wall niche from the dirt under Gaius's trophy between 250, when the graffiti wall was built, and 337, when the necropolis was sealed. In 1963, Cardinal Montini, who as a Monsignor in 1939 had dispatched Father Carroll on the mission to George Strake and had retained Guarducci in 1952, succeeded Pope St. John XXIII, taking the name Paul VI. Guarducci met with the new pope to share the astounding results of the examination of the graffiti wall bones. The pope cautiously authorized various additional tests by Gurecki. These tests proved the purple cloth adhering to the bones to be of Imperial Roman 2nd or 3rd century origin, both by their weave and their dye. Moreover, the dirt fragments on the bones matched exactly the soil in the central grave under the trophy of Gaius. Additional forensic examinations validated Gurecki's conclusions. When presented with the results, Ferrua completely denied their validity. In late 1964, Guarducci compiled a report for publication by the Vatican. The report concluded that it was virtually certain that Peter's bones had been found. It further deduced that Peter had originally been buried in the soil at the center of St. Peter's, marked by Gaius's trophy. His remains were then covered with a purple cloth and removed, between 250 when the graffiti wall was built and 337 when St. Peter's was completed, to the small marble-lined graffiti wall niche marked with the encoded epigraphs. They had remained there until 1941, since the niche walls were totally intact. At least 20 inscriptions on the wall referred to Peter and had clearly been written there before the sealing of the necropolis in 337. Paul VI submitted the report and all working materials to 5 disinterested experts, 3 archaeologists and 2 specialists in Greek epigraphy. All 5 concluded unanimously that the report was impeccably accurate and that Guarducci had found Peter. Ferrua's reaction was that the Pope was simply deaf to information, and that Guarducci was a woman whose faith caused her to overstate or misinterpret results. Chapter 17. Ferrua's Revenge. The publication of Guarducci's report in February 1965 initiated one of the greatest firestorms of controversy in archaeological history. The critics were led, not surprisingly, by Antonio Ferrua. He attacked Guarducci's earlier book on the inscriptions as the product of an authoress with faith that ought to move mountains but who was fundamentally wrong. She was portrayed as doctoring her results to support her faith, a curious inversion of the facts since it seems her faith had come alive as a result of the inscriptions. She was ridiculed for identifying the remains of the mouse that had crawled into the storage box and died as the relics of Peter. Further, Ferrua pointed to 2 coins found nearby, one dating from AD 357, the other from the Middle Ages. Ferrua relied on this as proof that the bones could not possibly date as early as Guarducci supposed. He also submitted a report to Pope Paul VI ridiculing Guarducci's claims and pleading with the Pope to ignore them as wholly speculative and only a woman's act of faith. Reading the attacks, it is hard to ignore Ferrua's repeated reference to Guarducci as a woman, operating only on unsupported faith. Perhaps this is simply an example of the endemic sexism of mid-20th century Italy, but coming from a priest it certainly gives one pause. After all, Christ's first chosen messenger was a woman, the Samaritan woman at the well in the 4th chapter of the Gospel according to John. This woman had been married 5 times and was living unmarried with a 6th man, yet Christ chose her as his first messenger to the Samaritans. Many early Christian inscriptions depicted her with her jar, including inscriptions in the necropolis. What's more, given the scientific investigation and mountain of evidence assembled by Guarducci, Gurecki, and the team of 5 experts, it seems like willful blindness on the part of Ferrua to dismiss the results as simply an act of Guarducci's faith. Guarducci, who had already spent nearly 15 years on the Apostle Project, worked for almost 3 more years to answer Ferrua and other critics with additional scientific and forensic studies. Examination of the purple and gold threads by chemists at the University of Rome proved once again that they were textiles from the 1st through the 3rd centuries. The weave and purple dye had been used only by Imperial Romans of the period. It was also determined that the later coins and many others left by Christians had fallen through cracks in the walls over the millennia, particularly since a coin was found in the graffiti wall dating from AD 14, before the graffiti wall was even framed. The graffiti wall niche where the bones had initially been found was dismantled by experts. Bricks of Roman origin proved the niche and the bones had remained untouched since original construction, certainly before the construction of the first basilica circa 337. In 1966, Guarducci responded to her critics by pamphlet and article. In her view, overwhelming cumulative evidence proved that these bones, located only 2 feet from the center of the necropolis and surrounded by at least 20 inscriptions predating 337 indicating near Peter, Peter is here, and the like, belonged to Peter. She asserted they were buried originally in the soil under the Trophy of Gaius, then moved between 250 and 337 into the concealment of the graffiti wall. She believed it likely that the bones had been moved to protect them during the construction of the original St. Peter's Basilica. Ferrua organized a furious resistance by numerous Vatican insiders, begging the Pope to ignore the bones. He argued there was no real evidence that Peter's body was ever buried on the hill as opposed to thrown in the Tiber. Ferrua later described Paul VI as simply deaf, like Pius XII. On June 26, 1968, Pope Paul VI announced to the world that Peter's bones had been found, concluding that the bone fragments recovered by Guarducci from the necropolis had been identified in a way that we can consider convincing. The following day, the bones were returned in fiberglass boxes to the graffiti wall niche from which they had emerged more than 25 years before. The largest of them remained visible in the wall through transparent fiberglass. But in the Vatican that day, there remained at least one who rejected and bitterly resented these findings, Guarducci's arch-nemesis Antonio Ferrua. Following his exclusion from active participation in the excavation after Guarducci was placed in charge, he continued to hold a variety of powerful positions within the Vatican. By the late 1970s, he had been made head of the Commission on Archaeology, and he waited. Requiescat in pace. Pope Pius XII died in 1958. Fittingly, George Strake established the Pius XII Memorial Library at St. Louis University, leading a fund drive to endow it with $5 million to microfilm and thereby preserve all of the ancient documents of the Vatican Library in Rome that had provided the clues guiding the Peter excavation. Strake wanted to preserve these invaluable documents. As happened in the catastrophic destruction of the ancient libraries at Alexandria and Constantinople, a single fire, bomb, or modern vandal could have destroyed the only copies of the vast array of ancient documents housed within the Vatican Library. The work involved the filming of well over 1 million books and manuscripts and more than 37,000 ancient codices, some crumbling. In the 1950s, Strake also gave away his beloved Glen Erie, selling it for a nominal price to a Protestant organization associated with Billy Graham's message. The buyers also sought to acquire Strake's legendary acreage at nearby Eagle Lake, but he refused to include it. He simply couldn't bring himself to part with it. On the day of closing, however, Strake said he had prayed about it all night and threw in his beloved Eagle Lake property for nothing. This generous act was consistent with a life spent sacrificially giving away even the things he treasured most. In 1969, Strake died suddenly at the age of 74. On August 6th, his car stopped while he was on a drive near Columbus, Texas. He climbed out and began to push it in the hot August sun. The task was too much. His great heart stopped. He did not reach his objective of giving away his last dollar with his last breath, but he made a strong attempt. He left almost all of his remaining assets to a foundation to continue his work. Friends mourned him from Texas to Rome, including his friend Pope Paul VI. His financing of the Apostle Project remained secret even at his funeral and in his obituary, but Strake died secure in the knowledge that Peter had been located. Within a short time, another great tree fell, Archbishop Joseph McGuff. Following his involvement in the Apostle Project and in the various events of World War II, Paul VI sent him as a special emissary to South Africa to oppose apartheid, and then on a final, unsuccessful mission to Ireland to end its religious conflicts. These deaths were a blow to Guarducci, whose friends and defenders were slowly vanishing. Only Paul VI himself remained to maintain her position in the Vatican. Ferrua meanwhile continued his campaign against Guarducci and her discoveries. In reviews which he wrote directly or inspired, Ferrua questioned Guarducci, her findings, and specifically the authentication of the graffiti wall bones now on display in the necropolis as those of St. Peter. Over time, Ferrua slowly became the most powerful Vatican official in archaeology, gaining control of the vast necropolis. In December 1971, National Geographic published an article describing Guarducci's great discovery and featuring her as central to the excavation project. Ferrua was mentioned only as an unnamed scientist who questioned the discovery. In 1977, the Vatican published a small book by Guarducci, Peter, the Rock on Which the Church is Built, beginning with Paul VI's thanks for the successful discovery of Peter's relics. Clearly, Guarducci's great work was held in great esteem by those at the highest levels of the Catholic Church. But very soon, the tide would turn. Chapter 18. The Necropolis Uncovered. Margherita Guarducci focused her greatest efforts from 1952 forward on locating Peter and decoding the inscriptions. However, she likewise expended great energy in preserving, studying, and understanding the underground necropolis. The area was in substantial disrepair when she arrived, and it was part of Guarducci's genius to recognize the treasures the necropolis held for archaeologists. It contained the ashes, bones, and memorials of more than 1,000 Romans from the height of Roman power, dating mostly from AD 160 to 250. It was in effect a village of more than 22 major family tombs built along a road more than 100 feet long on the side of Vatican Hill. Before they were covered by the original basilica, the tombs had overlooked a large highway leading into Rome. Such tombs had been constructed for two principal reasons: to display the importance of the involved family to the world and to provide a meeting place for the family itself to hold parties and remember the dead. On the Feast of Parentalia, similar to the Mexican Day of the Dead, and at other times, families would gather to feast in the tombs, often dining on flat sarcophagus lids set up as dining room tables to pass the evening with pleasant talk. The excavation team had identified the tombs by letters: A, built first, and then succeeding letters. Most held single families, but some were more like early condominiums used and owned by several families. When she was placed in charge of the excavation, Guarducci invited some of the greatest experts of the age to explore and detail the tombs, including Jocelyn Toynbee and a bevy of famous British and German archaeologists. The earlier secrecy disappeared, and a large international effort to study the tombs ensued. A certain haunting tragedy filled the site. Once magnificent structures high on a hill overlooking eternal Rome in its greatest age now lay, long abandoned, 15 to 60 feet underground. The Roman Empire itself was long gone, but the art and sculpture within the tombs was breathtaking. The famous Tomb of the Chariot features a magnificent mosaic floor depicting a long-ago rider and chariot. The Tomb of Julii was almost schizophrenic, combining pagan and Christian murals, mixing Jonah and the Good Shepherd with Christ, depicted as the pagan god Helios. So-called Tomb F, built for freed slaves, was an extraordinary kaleidoscope of bright and vivid murals ranging from swans swimming forever in an idyllic landscape to flowered candelabras with blue blooms, to a unique early trompe-l'oeil mask appearing to hang from a wall. In another mural, Venus reclines on a mussel shell carried by Tritons, anticipating Titian's Venus of Urbino in Florence, while nearby huntsmen forever pursue lions. Indeed, many of the tomb paintings foreshadow the themes of the Renaissance, and their children may be found in museums from the Louvre to the Uffizi. Two tombs in particular tell stories, one happy and one sad. The Tomb of the Marcii. This was the massive tomb of a rich and apparently jolly ex-slave named Quintus Marcius Hermes. The Marcii prospered in Rome despite their lowly beginnings. Their impressive tomb is the third largest in the necropolis and faces south, where it once overlooked the road before its burial beneath Constantine's basilica. Its reddish-brown brick exteriors once proudly proclaimed the wealth of the Marcii, but it is the interior that truly reveals their story. In addition to grand scenes of blue skies and rivers with ducks, red fish, and white flamingos, and the sea with dolphins, mythical seahorses, and seals, the tomb contains a set of scenes resembling movie posters in a modern theater. To adorn their final resting place, the Marcii picked two extraordinary scenes from Euripides. Euripides could be called the Steven Spielberg of ancient Greece. He authored approximately 92 plays, of which perhaps 18 survive. He was most famous as the first playwright to humanize his characters so that even today an audience can identify with them as people. In the tomb, one scene from the Bacchae depicts a king named Pentheus being stabbed and killed by his own mother, driven mad by the gods. The second, from Alcestis, portrays the hero Hercules rescuing the princess Alcestis from the depths of Hades itself, restoring her to her husband and life. It is obviously a hopeful scene for a tomb, although there is no record that the Marcii were so fortunate. In addition to the Euripides scenes, the Marcii included paintings of the mother of Rome's founders and a mural of Leda and the swan. The tomb is surprisingly cheerful, and the centerpiece is the sarcophagus of Quintus himself and his wife, Marcia. Their portraits, joined by an inscription proclaiming their eternal love for one another. The tomb of the Valerii. There is no sadder place in the necropolis than the tomb of the Valerii. It is the largest of all the tombs, built around AD 160 at the height of the Pax Romana and Roman power. It is massively and ornately decorated with images of gods like Oceanus and Pan, and philosophers. The tomb is commanded by a striking bust of an intensely proud, bearded family founder, Gaius Valerius Hermes. Nearby is the bust of his wife, Flavia, chin in hand, pensively staring into eternity. Likewise, there is a portrait of his daughter and a cheerful-looking bust of his 4-year-old grandson, Gaius, contemplating with hope a future that would never come. Inscriptions within this sad place make clear that Gaius's daughter, grandson, and wife all died before him, leaving him stripped of his family. Finally, the tomb contained 2 death masks, each made at the time of death. The first is of young Gaius, no longer the plump, bubbling child of the bust, but instead with a face tortured by illness and eyes forever closed. The second is the death mask of Gaius himself, thin, sad, beaten, wrinkled, and battered by the world. These tombs, masterpieces of art and sculpture, stand in dramatic contrast with the very simple and humble graves of early Christians generally encountered closer to Peter's grave. The contrast may reflect the difference between the early Christian view of a grave as simply a way station and the view of the Romans who believed they would live only in the memory of the living and wished an appropriate final stop. It is certain that all of them, Christians and pagans alike, would be quite surprised to find their final resting places, once on a hill overlooking eternal Rome, now buried 15 to 60 feet underground beneath a massive Christian basilica. Part of Guarducci's genius was recognizing, preserving, detailing, and opening to experts like Toynbee the necropolis tombs, so full of history, as well as long-ago hopes and dreams. Yet none of this would save her following Paul VI's death.